The winds of change were no longer whispers. By the late 19th century, Africa's kingdoms had stood tall for centuries. They had traded with the world, built stone cities, and fought legendary wars. But now, the continent faced a storm unlike any before. It was not a warlord or a rival empire. It was a new force, Europe, armed with industrial weapons, hungry for land, and blinded by greed. This was the colonial era. The moment when Africa, once the master of its own destiny, found itself carved apart like a pie on someone else's table. Europe in the late 1800s was restless. Industrial revolutions had turned tiny islands like Britain into world powers. Factories roared, ships steamed, and nations craved more markets, more raw materials, more land. Africa, with its gold, ivory, timber, fertile soils, and millions of people, became the target. But there was a problem. By the early 19th century, only small corners of Africa were under European control: coastal forts, trading posts, a few settlements. The interior remained largely African. Kingdoms, empires, and societies still ruled themselves. To European eyes, this was empty land. To Africans, it was home. But then came explorers and missionaries. Livingstone, Stanley, Moffat. They returned to Europe with tales of vast rivers, endless plains, and unimaginable wealth. Suddenly, Africa wasn't just the dark continent. It was the next prize. And so, the race began. Belgium's King Leopold II was the first to make a bold move. In the 1870s, he sent Henry Morton Stanley into Congo. Stanley, with gunboats and treaties no African fully understood, claimed massive swaths of land for Leopold. The Belgian king didn't present it as conquest but as philanthropy, civilizing the Congo. In reality, it was greed hidden under velvet words. When France, Germany, and Britain realized Leopold had quietly taken a territory larger than Western Europe, panic erupted. No one wanted to be left behind. Colonial rivalry, already brewing in Asia and the Americas, now turned its gaze fully to Africa. Something had to be done, or at least, that was the excuse. And so, in November 1884, delegates from 13 European powers and the United States gathered in Berlin. They met not in a battlefield or marketplace, but in a grand hall decorated with chandeliers, velvet curtains, and polished wood. The host was German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, a man who once dismissed colonies as worthless, but now saw them as bargaining chips in Europe's balance of power. There were no Africans present. Not a king, not a chief, not even an interpreter to speak on their behalf. The fate of millions was being decided without a single voice from the continent itself. Maps were rolled out across long tables. Pens dipped in ink scratched over rivers and coastlines. Arguments erupted, deals were struck, compromises made. Where one line stopped, another began. With every stroke, Africa was being divided into neat, artificial shapes, lines that ignored mountains, rivers, languages, or cultures. This was not a negotiation. This was an auction. Britain, with its naval dominance, claimed vast territories from Cairo to Cape Town, dreaming of a red line across Africa. France, ambitious and determined, stretched from the Atlantic coast across the Sahara to the Nile. Germany, late to the colonial game, demanded its share, seizing land in Southwest and East Africa. Belgium clung tightly to Leopold's Congo, disguising exploitation with the language of progress. Portugal, once the pioneer of African trade, scrambled to keep its old posts alive. Each territory was spoken of like property deeds, like estates being divided among heirs. No one asked what kingdoms already existed there. No one asked what languages were spoken, what traditions were practiced, or what alliances bound communities together. The Ashanti Empire, the Sokoto Caliphate, the Kingdom of Buganda, all ignored. Instead, new names were scribbled: British East Africa, French West Africa, German Cameroon. An entire continent was split in hours. The silence of Africans in Berlin was not just absence. It was erasure. The Berlin Conference ended in February 1885. The General Act of Berlin laid out the rules of colonization. If a European power wanted to claim territory, it had to establish effective control, not just plant a flag. Free trade along the Congo and Niger rivers was promised, though really it meant free for Europeans. The slave trade, they declared, should be suppressed, though forced labor soon replaced it in many colonies. On paper, it looked orderly. In reality, it was a scramble. Over the next 20 years, armies marched, treaties were forced, and wars were fought as Europe rushed to turn lines on maps into dominion on the ground. The effects were immediate and devastating. Kingdoms were broken. Families were split. Borders cut across tribes, linking rivals and dividing kin. The Igbo, Yoruba, and Hausa Fulani, once separate nations, would soon be forced into a nation. Cameroon would be sliced and handed from Germany to Britain and France. Somalia would be cut into pieces, shared by Britain, Italy, and France. Everywhere, the story was the same: local autonomy replaced by distant rule. Traditions dismissed, leaders undermined, resources extracted. Africa was not invited to the table, but she would pay the price for centuries. Europe told itself it was bringing civilization. They spoke of roads, schools, and Christianity. But behind the mask was exploitation. Railways were not built for Africans to travel, but for goods to reach ports. Schools were few, designed to train clerks, not leaders. Missionaries preached equality under God, while colonial officials practiced inequality on the ground. When the conference ended, maps were folded, treaties signed, and the men in Berlin returned home satisfied. In just a few months, the future of an entire continent had been rewritten. No one in Berlin knew how deep the scars would run. No one knew that the borders they had drawn so carelessly would ignite wars, shape identities, and stir conflicts that still burn today. To them, Africa was not a home. It was a prize.